the minute countdown. And for those of you that just joined us, if you have any questions that you'd like to ask of Cheryl, I will be monitoring the chat and the Q&A. So please feel free to type anything you'd like to know besides her age into the chat boxes. We'll be getting started in about a minute. All right. Well, thank you all for joining us this evening. My name is Annie Tillman. I am the Adult Program Coordinator here at the Schaumburg Library, and I want to give a special thanks and shout out to the AAUW for helping us organize and bring this program to us in honor of International Women's Month, International Women's Day, which happened yesterday, and Women's History Month. Cheryl is a groundbreaking reporter. Let me give you a brief background before we get started, highlighting some of her wonderful accomplishments. So Cheryl has been in Chicago radio since 1979. She has been on the air at WMAQ, WMVP, and WCBR over those years. Currently, she can be heard on WBEZ Radio 91.5 FM, Chicago Public Radio. Cheryl, can you tell us a little bit about how you got into broadcast journalism in the first place, and sports in particular?
Well, let me start with the sports angle.
Sure.
I was a kid that played. I have 8 brothers and sisters, more sisters than brothers, and so sports was kind of like our outlet. I couldn't play Little League because I was not allowed. I was a girl.
Wow.
And I also graduated before Title IX, so I couldn't play sports in college. But I played a lot of sports as a kid: softball, volleyball. I ran track. So I did a lot of that. And so that was my love for it. But then I also started watching sports as a kid. My grandfather came from Poland, and he was a big baseball fan. He drove a coal truck, and he actually used to deliver to Wrigley Field and Old Comiskey Park. So he loved baseball. He lived with us. So we would sit in the living room with his beer and his cigarette and his baseball games. And so I got to watch baseball, and he actually taught me a lot about how to watch it. And then I started getting into other sports, watching football and basketball. I played basketball too, and I loved playing basketball. But softball was my big sport. I was a second baseman. And when I was in 8th grade, I actually made the all-star team, but it was the same day as my graduation, so I couldn't go. But that's how so my sports background is doing it and watching it and loving it. And so you fast forward, I had a long journey to get through college because I didn't have any financial support. I had to do it all on my own. And so I went to Wright Junior College first, and I did theater at night. I worked a job. I worked in a factory, and going to college too. So after I finished getting that degree, then I went to Columbia College, and that's where I got my foothold into journalism, radio, and TV. But I'm not a TV person. I'm a radio person. That's my love. But after getting that degree, and I also doing internships actually helped me. Got my foot in the door, got used to the business side of it. And when I was I was in between. I went to CLR, and I was working in the research department, and I just didn't want to do that anymore. They wanted me to go into sales. I'm going, I can't sell anything. So then what I did was I went back to, I was waitressing. So I went to waitressing again. And I get a phone call from Columbia College. What was great about Columbia College in that era was that they would get jobs for you in the business. And they called me up and they said, we have a job for you at MAQ Radio. Now, MAQ Radio was 670 AM. That was a big station. It was a country western station. So 40 years ago, on March 1st, that's when I started working at WMAQ Radio. And so when I went to MAQ Radio, I was the midday producer for a wonderful, wonderful disc jockey, Terry Stevens. But the station started evolving to get into eventually to talk and sports. And so I transitioned into that. Long story short.
Yeah. What's the difference or main differences between being behind the scenes on like the producer side of it versus on the front end as the person doing the reporting and interviewing?
I think everybody should produce first before they want the aspirations to go in the air, because you need to know how to do everything. You need to know timing. You need to know what the listeners want to hear. You need to, and to be a reporter, you got to have people skills. And I think dealing with listeners, dealing with viewers, dealing with readers, you get to feel a little bit more empathy and a little more of a handle on what people really want to know. And I'm nosy too. I like to talk to people. I like to ask questions. I like to find out what's going on. But I think that was really important. And then, because what I was fortunate was when I transitioned to being on the air, I had some great people behind me. My news director, Tom Webb, he got me my after card. And so he got me on the air, and I was working with Chet Kopic. He was with Kopic on Sports, and he was was a big, big personality. And through all that, I learned a lot about radio. When I was a producer, I learned a lot about what makes it work, what doesn't work, how to do timing, which is very important in radio.
Mm-hmm.
So that was all part and parcel of what I learned.
That's wonderful. Because sports is traditionally a man's world, what was it like breaking into that before it's been more acceptable and widely?
I was the only woman on radio. And most times I was the only woman covering games. In fact, I was the first woman to go into most of the locker rooms in Chicago. Jeannie Morris was a TV personality, but she never went in the locker rooms.
Okay.
And in fact, I didn't know that. One time I was at a Bulls game and I came out of the locker room. I had to go and do a live report. And she stopped me and she said, "You're very brave." And I go, "What do you mean brave?" She goes, "I've never been in the locker room, covering games." I was like, whoa, I didn't know that. And I had a lot of problems too, because when I was sent to cover the Bears games, and I covered the games, and I could go into games, but my boss sent me to cover practices at Hallis Hall. This is the old Hallis Hall in Lake Forest. And so I went there. It was because it was during the week. I believe it was a Wednesday. It was the first time I went there. And they call you go into the locker room to cover the team after a practice. I'm going with everybody else. I didn't know that there'd never been a woman. As I went in the room, the players surrounded me, swore at me, yelled at me, and kicked me out. So I had to sit outside on the floor, and they would have to bring players to me. And, Walter Payton one time sat next to me, goes, "Oh, you could go in, you could go in." I'm going, "Yeah, right." But it was a rookie by the name of Jim Harbaugh, who came out to be interviewed by me, because that's where I had to do it. And he goes, "Why is she out here? Why isn't she in the locker room like she is after games?" They couldn't answer. So he literally and figuratively opened the door and walked me in. So, I mean, I've had some of those challenges. Tony La Russa, who was the manager when I first started, he's back. He actually was the best. Here he is as manager, and he took me to all the security guards and said, "Please don't hassle her. She's credentialed." Because back then your credential didn't have your picture on it, just had your name. And he said, "Make sure you let her in," because some places wouldn't.
Yeah. How has that evolved over time? Because it sounds like it was really challenging at first, but has it gotten more?
I don't have any issues now, but see, they don't want anybody in the locker room.
Right.
They don't want anybody. And because of the last year, we are not in locker rooms anymore. We do everything by Zoom calls. But what I used to do, I would talk to young players, especially baseball. Back when I started going in the locker rooms in the early 80s, the thing was the young players had never been around women, actually, even in high school or college. And most of the time they went straight from high school to baseball. into major leagues or minor leagues and major leagues. So they've never been around women. So I would sit them down and talk to them and say, look, this is what I need to do. So you understand what I need to do. And that way we could have a good rapport. And that's the way I had to do. But fast forward, it's not as challenging as it used to be. Players now, they're used to it. And also they've actually, through colleges, particularly, they've actually kind of trained them to understand what the roles are of the media, because everybody has a different role.
Sure.
Radio is different from TV, different from print, and even print, you've got your columnists, you have your beat guys and gals, so it's all different.
One of the questions that came in on our chat is, who would you consider that gave you your first big break into the sports scene?
Well, it would be my bosses that I had. I had Ted Kramer, then they had Bill Gamble. Those were the those were the program directors at MAQ Radio, and Tom Webb. But Chet Kopic, he didn't hire me. I was already working there before he was even there. And so they said, Cheryl's going to be your producer. And now I grew to appreciate Chet, but at that, when I heard him talk to somebody on the phone, and he didn't know that I was there, he says, yeah, I got some broad working for me. But you know what? I think we understood each other. He respected me and I respected him to be able to do what I do. But it was management. I was fortunate that I had forward-thinking management. Not everybody has it. Now, they didn't protect me. I mean, when I had these issues, they didn't protect me. I had to do that on my own. And there were times inside, sometimes I was crushed, but I couldn't let anybody know it because of what I was dealing with. And the worst part was my peers, the men around me, would smirk. They enjoyed the fact if I was being, chastised, which that kind of got to me too. They would smirk it, and they could have helped me, but they wouldn't. Because as one said to me, he says, you're taking one of our jobs, the white male job.
Yeah, that sounds challenging.
No, it's more aggravating than anything.
Yes, definitely. Can you tell us a little bit more about your segment, the one-on-one with Cheryl Raye-Stout, and the figures that you got to interview during that time in your life?
When I first started, one of my I think I really enjoyed doing this interview was I interviewed the wife of Jimbo Covert, the Hall of Fame left tackle of the Chicago Bears. I interviewed his wife. And this is, again, I just thought, what was it like being the wife of a player that I know got banged up, that he had to deal, and how she had to handle helping him. And it was very revealing. She was telling me how he could barely get out of bed, that she had to help him put socks on, or, had to give him his medication, or and how it took, because everyone, we could see the player's angle, but I wanted to find out what it was like at home. And at home is where they could let their guard down. And that's where they would be, get themselves back on their feet. And so that was one of those things, one of those interviews I enjoyed. My most challenging intellectually, and which was one of the most, I still to this day, I interviewed Arthur Ashe for 45 minutes. And anyone that knew Arthur Ashe or had ever interviewed him knows that he is intellectually was much more superior than me. There's no doubt about it. But I learned an awful lot about him. I learned about his depth and his care and his love about letting the African-American community know about their sports history before the 60s or 70s, way back. And so he was very, very, and what I didn't know at the time, he actually had just found out that he was HIV positive. I think he was AIDS at that point, but I didn't know that. And so I walked away from that interview and I was like, I was drained because it was just challenging. It was wonderful. And it was very insightful. But, when I've done these interviews, I want to find out the human side of the person. I want to find out about them. I want to find out why they do it, and I like to hear them talk. I like to hear what they have to say, and I love when they tell me something that I have no idea. Like, wow, in my head, I'm trying to be stoic enough where like,
Sure.
wow, this is really good. This is really exciting.
What is the process like preparing for an interview?
I do a lot of research on people, but I also, when I first started, I used to take copious notes, the notes. And one of the things I learned too is really find out about their family life. Because I'll tell you a little something that happened to me when I was first getting to do this. Um, the men I was working with sometimes were a little bit difficult to be around. And they told me, says, we want you to call this particular head coach. I didn't know that there was an issue with this head coach that liked to, let's just say he liked women more than his wife. So they gave me the phone number to call up this particular head coach, and I call him up and I get the wife, and she starts screaming at me. There's no women doing radio in Chicago. And she's going on and on and on. And I just apologize. I said, I'm sorry. I am. I'll call back later, or, can I leave a message?
Yeah.
I was kind of flummoxed at first. And I finished that conversation, and they were smirking. The guys were smirking. And I go, that's when I learned not just finding out about, I had a Rolodex. For those of you who don't know what a Rolodex is, this is before cell phones. You had phone numbers, on paper, you put the phone number down. But on that Rolodex, I'd have the person's name and their phone number, and I would have stuff about their family. The wife's name or the girlfriend's name or their children's name or their mother, anything, just a little bit of personal information so that they would be more comfortable with me when I called up. Because back then, they were the first person that picked up the phone most times.
Sure.
And men I like to small talk. And sometimes when you small talk somebody, they're a little more comfortable.
Sure.
And that's how I got to, I've had some wild times. Luke Appling was a famous White Sox shortstop, and called him up one time, but got his wife first, and I knew her name, and she got me to him. And, and actually that also happened with Red Grange. I went to I call it 411 in Florida. And I go, can I get Harold Grange's number? So they gave me his number. It was listed. Who knew? And I get his wife, and I explained to her what I wanted to do. And he didn't like doing phone calls. He did not like doing interviews. She put him on the phone, and I was able to interview Red Grange.
Oh, wow.
That was pretty exciting.
We do have some questions that came in on the Q&A. Any thoughts on the Mark Greco situation?
I know Mark very well. And I think this is something that is recently happening with people saying things on the air that they don't mean. But when I actually saw it, and I didn't think anything of it, because I didn't think he was making a comment about her, about Cheryl Burton. I thought he was making a comment about those those shows and the moderators. I think we've learned now that if you say anything, people are going to react. And I thought if Cheryl had gone to Mark and explained to him how bad she felt about it, that could have been taken care of, but she went to HR instead. And I think at that point, I think it's just challenging for anybody in that situation. I think management, though, they look at how much money he makes, and this is an easy way to get rid of him if they were trying to get rid of him too. It's an unfortunate situation, and I have to say this, but because I like Mark a lot, and he did call me just recently to let me know what was going on, and it's tough.
So before we logged on, we were talking a little bit about like sports documentaries and kind of how those stories get told. Can you tell us a little bit more about your relationship kind of on the day-to-day with some of the teams and players that you've developed and how those have been established?
Well, the one thing is when you do the day-to-day, I'll give you an idea on the different sports have different ways of doing it. In baseball, they have open locker room
Mm.
an hour and a half before first pitch. So you're in there early, and so you could talk to somebody, and you could find information, you could do interviews, you could set up stuff, and then you do then you cover the game, and then after the game you go in the locker room again, and you get the post game reaction to what happened on the field. But it gives you that way of being able to see something in person, observe it in person, and find out from the players themselves what happened or didn't happen or should have
Mhm.
happened. The problem is too many people nowadays, they sit behind a mic or they sit in at home and they write something, and they haven't talked to the person. They haven't talked to them to find out why something happened or how something happened. And the different sports, like in football, we go to their practices. We don't get to see the practice, but we get to go in the open locker room area and we get to talk to them again. You could talk, they have the group times, and then they also have one-on-one. My style has always been off to the side, one-on-ones. That's what I feel more comfortable with.
Mhm.
Because I look at, I don't get into, stats as much as people do. You could get stats anywhere, but what I'd like to find out is the whys, the how, you know, kind of shaping why it happened, how it happened,
Mhm.
what could happen, what's next. And so that's my style. I like the conversation rather than, just throwing darts at somebody. and
Sure.
and basketball for me, like I was so fortunate. I got to cover Michael Jordan from beginning when he left to play baseball, which I broke that story, and when he came back. And because I was at the Berto, actually go back further, when he
Mhm.
was playing it, actually they practiced in another place, and I actually would sit there. And what they had, Phil Jackson eventually put a curtain up. There wasn't a curtain there. We used to watch practice. It's like, holy crap, Michael just hit somebody. So then they put a curtain up, and when Michael came back and they were at the Berto, they moved to the Berto, and players would like crimp the shade for me so
Mhm.
I could see stuff. but because I was there and the curtain was there, when they had at that point they had a steel curtain. When that curtain was there, and I heard Michael Jordan practicing, I knew that sound. Where
Oh
the few
wow.
quarters that were left didn't know that sound, because Michael Jordan's practice was loud and crazy and intense. And by the sound is why I was able to know that Michael was behind that curtain. And I had gotten a phone call from somebody from Florida saying that Michael had walked out of baseball camp with the White
Mhm.
Sox. And so I put two and two together. And then I had a third person that called me up and said, Michael's there. So I kept it to myself,
That's
wait until
incredible.
after practice. And Phil Jackson, did his talk with us. And I waited till after the other reporters left, because at that time, everyone had left except for a few reporters.
Mhm.
The TV wasn't covering anymore because nobody. So I waited till they all left, and I go to Phil, and he's going to this. I go, Phil, Mike was here, isn't he? He goes, how do you know? I'm going, yeah, I can tell. And he had that wry smile on his
Oh
face, and he
wow.
goes, yeah. And then I found BJ Armstrong by myself, and I go, so how does he look? And he told
Mhm.
me. So I waited till everybody left, and I called up the station, and I I said, look, Michael's here. I think he's coming back. It seems like he's coming back. As I'm on the phone live doing this report,
Wow.
because back then I had a beeper. We didn't have cell phones. I
Mhm.
had a beeper, and I tossed the beeper because it was bothering me. A friend of a player was calling me up, said that he had Michael Jordans to talk to me. And I missed the call.
Oh my
But I had the
goodness.
story. I did have the story.
What's it like breaking a story like that? Like the emotional journey and
You know what? The base for him going to play baseball,
sure.
that took a few weeks to do. And there was a lot of let's just say the peaks and valleys of it, but it was your heart is going because you're going, okay, if I'm wrong, I'm in trouble,
Right.
But I had a lot of ducks in order, and the story breaks. And the interesting thing is Michael was working out at IIT, and there was a baseball card coming out with Wayne Gretzky, Reggie Jackson, and Michael Jordan. So they were having a press conference. It's the first time Michael was talking publicly about playing baseball because it was in conjunction with this card. So I put my recording device on my table, and Michael looks at me and goes, "How you doing, Cheryl?" And I said, "I'm busy." I said, "Are you okay with what I've been saying?" He goes, "You're all right." At that point you go, "Oh, okay, I'm okay." But because you worry, because the one thing about a reporter, your integrity, your credibility, and your honesty has got to be out front. You've got to have that. Otherwise, you're never going to be trusted. And being trusted, to me, is the most important aspect of being a reporter.
Definitely. Building those relationships sounds really important and special. Are there any interviews that are more memorable than others that you'd like to share?
I got some interesting ones. There, I had developed a rapport with a young White Sox player in 1986. His name was Bobby Bonilla. And Bobby Bonilla was a rookie. And at that time, Tony La Russa was still managing. And I got to know Bobby, and he was a young player, had emotion. They fired Tony La Russa, Hawk Harrelson, which was one of the biggest blunders in Sox history. And there's a story behind that too, what he tried to do. So he fires Tony La Russa. So then they hired Jim Fregosi. And Bobby Bonilla was going through a personal issue. And he started spiraling as far as his at the plate. He just wasn't concentrating. And I took him aside. I said, "What's wrong?" And he told me what happened. There was that personal thing going on, and I just felt horrible because I said, "You should tell management." He goes, I can't. So they trade him. The White Sox trade him for Jose De Leon. Well, that's another story. He's a guy that had 20 losses. He gets traded to Pittsburgh. So he gets traded to Pittsburgh, and so the Pirates come to Wrigley Field for the first time later that year, which would be, I think it was September. Remember, he's a rookie. And so I said, I'm standing talking with him behind the batting cage when they're having BP. And up comes walking this very slender young man. And Bobby goes, "Cheryl, I want you to meet Barry Bonds. Barry, treat Cheryl well. She took care of me. She was very kind to me when I was here." Barry Bonds always gave me an interview when he came to Chicago. Now, he didn't get along with anybody, but it got to a point when after I had my son, he'd see me. He goes, "How's your son doing?" And he would give me interviews. And people go, how did I go? Because a player, his friend Bobby Bonilla, told him to be nice to me, and he wasn't nice to a lot of people too. Wow. It was wild, but it's very, it's rewarding, but it's like, gee, sometimes you always feel like you're just trying hard all the time, and you're just hoping that it works, and sometimes it doesn't. The first time I encountered Carlton Fisk, who I loved him when he was with Boston. So he's with the White Sox, and Carlton Fisk is a big man. He's an imposing man. He's he's very strident. And the first time I'm going to him after a game, post game, and I go up to him and I'm getting my recorder, and I don't want to be nervous or anything like that. And he goes to me, "What do you want?" And I go, "I just want to talk to you. Just want to give you some post." And he goes, and he kind of nodded and goes, "Okay, she passed the test." And I'm like, "What the heck?" But it's that you have to accept the time, and I had to accept those type of situations, and I did. It wasn't a problem. But a few years ago, I'll tell you an interesting one I had to do on stage was doing an interview with Billie Jean King on stage in front of, it was a couple hundred people. And it was interesting because I had never met her before, personally, one-on-one. So the Women's Foundation asked me to do it. Chicago's Women's Foundation asked me to do it. And so I prepared, with somebody like Billie Jean King, and you're doing it with people that can see you, actually watch you and see you doing this interview. So I prepared, when you asked me before about preparing, I made sure that I had preparation that would work for the audience, for her, and try to get something fresh and different. What I didn't know was forget about it. What happened is I met her beforehand. I only like 10 minutes before we went on stage. That's all the time I had to go with. And I go on stage with her and she just starts, and it's like, she was like a feral cat. It's like, okay. And I go, okay, just breathe, and it worked. It was fine, and people seemed to enjoy it. And it was interesting, a very highly regarded female journalist in town that came up to her. She goes, I don't know how you got through that, because I could see it wasn't easy. And I said, thank you for noticing that, because I was about ready to have a heart attack.
Definitely. All the preparation in the world can't prepare
it didn't
you
matter.
when somebody...
Didn't matter. It's just like, you just go, but I only prepare now for something like that, something where, I had to do it for, I think it was almost half hour, 40, between half hour, 40 minutes. So you want to make sure that you have enough to ask. And I also believe that you ask a question, you listen to the answer. From the answer, you follow up with a different question, or, continuing the conversation.
Definitely.
That's what I did, but it was really something else.
Is there a different approach that you take for different sports too, depending on what?
Depending on the sport, because some sports, like, and it's also, you're doing a one-on-one interview is different than when you're doing post game. Mm-hmm. Post games like this, you gotta, and a lot of times you have to ask a question that the answer, but your audience wants to hear the answer. Sure. So sometimes you ask something like that. And the toughest interviews post game is after losses. Mm-hmm. Losing locker rooms also tells you about the character of the athlete. I bet. And the ones that would talk, like Michael Jordan talked to us after every game. Every game. He talked before games. He talked after games. He talked after practices. And there was players that would just, leave. And I will tell it, and people know this story about that. It was young in his career. Scottie Pippen would leave. He would just leave. He would not talk. And because Michael would always talk. And I was doing the Bulls post-game show on WMAQ radio. And I came up after the locker room and was, doing the interviews. And I go, yes, Scottie wouldn't talk. And they go, well, that's okay. Because no. This is not for the first time. He also put a note on his locker that says, I'm not talking today, peace. And I thought, wow, so I talked about it on the air. I said, look, if you want to be the level of Michael Jordan, part of it is actually doing post-game interviews. And I said on the air, well, apparently Scottie got mad at me. He didn't talk to me for a while. And he sent Horace Grant to say to me, Scottie's mad at you. I go, is this high school or grammar school?
Right.
And I said, look, I said to Horace, I said, did I say something that was incorrect? He says, no. He says, he was standing right there. He saw what happened. I said, because if I was wrong, I will admit it. I'm wrong. It took a while, almost a year. And Scottie sent a friend to me to say, Scottie wants to talk to you and get this taken care of. And I said, oh, again, we're in school. Again, but we ironed it out, and talk. But that happens. That happens. You can't always please everybody, and that's not my job. My job is to be honest, and we all make mistakes, and it's how you handle it and how you learn from it. And if you don't, you're not going to be in this business long. And I've been in the business a long time.
I appreciate that. That's a great outlook on it. Is there a different level of intensity too? Because I know you've covered a
Yes.
lot of championship
Oh
games
yeah.
and playoffs with the winning and the losing.
The winning as the first Bulls championship was interesting because it was a very small group of people that actually was in LA. In fact, and it was great because it was small. And I was in the locker room and, they actually did the presentation and I'm trying to interview everybody I can one-on-ones again, like I said, and I got Michael. So at one point I'm actually talking to Horace Grant in the bathroom. I'm
My
in the
goodness.
bathroom because there was no place to move. And so all of a sudden the crew from Walt Disney brings the players into the locker room to the, where are you going after winning the championship? Disney World. So they're all there. And I'm like, I'm in a bathroom after a championship. So we're in the bathroom. And then I realized John Paxson's not there. And Michael said that he wouldn't do that commercial unless John Paxson was there. So I'm shouting, "Where's Pax? Where's Pax?" and and then Michael's looking around and the Disney people are giving me dirty looks like, we got to get this done. I'm going, but there's no Paxson. So they finally get Paxson. I mean, things like that happen. I've had a camera dropped on my head.
Oh, ouch.
Yeah, I had full camera dropped on my head. That was covering a Bulls game. Covering the Bears when they won the Super Bowl was really interesting because, again, you didn't have the immediate intensity as far as numbers like you do now. I covered the Bears when they won and after the 85 season, and I covered them when they went to the Super Bowl in 06 season, the 07 game. And it was very different. We went into the locker room after the Bears won, and we waited outside a long time, a long, long time. We go in the locker room, and it's just watching all these things unfold. Walter Payton's over in one corner with Jesse Jackson. There was some things going on because he did not get an opportunity to score. Michael McCaskey is holding the trophy. But there was no alcohol. There was nothing like that, which I thought was very interesting.
Surprising.
And then I watched Buddy Ryan wanted to hurt the special teams coach, Steve Kaiser, because Leslie Frazier's career was ended that game. And they actually had, the guy's hiding in the room and Buddy Ryan's knocking on the door. And I'm like, whoa, didn't they just win? So you see some of that stuff.
Yeah.
But in baseball, it's wild because they celebrate after every round. Most sports don't, but baseball does. And they got the champagne going and it's crazy. And if you build relationship with players, you can get those. For me, you get those one-on-ones. A lot of times you're stuck with the post. And after the White Sox won in 05, and I had been there throughout the season, that's the other thing. You cannot just show up for playoffs. You cannot just show up when they're in the finals or the World Series. And it's during the World Series, and Aaron Rowan's the center fielder for the White Sox, and he kept turning down interview. People, hey, come out and do an interview with me. He goes, no. And I said, Aaron, can I do it? He goes, I'll do it with you because you've been here. And when we were talking about that before, about not being there, that's difference because they know when people just show up. Anthony Rizzo told me many times, like as they were marching to the World Series and that, he goes, you were there when we were losing. And I was like, yeah, I sat through some really stinkers. And it's interesting that they recognize that. People think that they could be fools. They're not fools. They know who has put in the time. They know that you have been responsible to take the onus and the time to cover them. And I'm at this point where they think I'm their mom or their, it was interesting. A couple years ago when Ben Zobrist got named to the All-Star game, and I had set up, and this stuff, when I do long form interviews, I set things up the day before. I don't just come up and, hey, can we sit down for 25, 30 minutes? Doesn't work that way. So Ben Zobrist, I had asked him the day before to do it. Actually, it was 2 days before, and he couldn't. And I went there the next day, and he said, "I can't do it today. I'll do it tomorrow." I said, "Fine. You can't get upset about that because things happen, and the schedules change." He gets named to the All-Star team, and I come walking to talk to him, and all the media was around him to talk to him because he was on the All-Star. He goes, "No, no, no. I promised her an interview yesterday. I didn't do it. I'm doing the interview with her now."
Wow.
And that's Ben Zobra's too. I mean, a lot of players are like that, but you're like, thank you,
Yeah, those
because
relationships, the trust, and those connections are really important.
Yes.
That's wonderful. Let me check in on again, if you have any questions that you'd like to ask, please feel free to drop those in the Q&A or into the chat, and I'll keep an eye on them. This is a great one about women's sports. Have you covered any women's professional sports, and are there distinct differences between women's sports and male sports?
I've covered the Sky. In fact, it was good last year when they were in the Wubble. So people understand I'm not misspeaking. Instead of calling it the bubble because it was women's, it's the Wubble down in Florida. It actually was helpful because I could be on the calls all the time. It's a hard now that they're Wintrust Arena. That's a difficult place to go. It's not easy. When they were at the Horizon / Allstate Arena / whatever name it is, it actually was easier to cover them. Now that they're in the city and it conflicts with baseball, it's not easy. So when they were down in Florida, that was really easy. And I used to go up to when Elena Deladone, who was with, she was an MVP and she took him to the final, and she was a difficult interview. She did not like doing interviews, but once you sat down with her, she was very, very good. And she was very, so, I've covered them somewhat. I've done a little bit of soccer, but not a lot. I've done high school sports, so I've done women's sports in that regard. And tennis. I used to cover women's tennis all the time. Martina Navratilova is one of the best interviews too.
Why is that?
She notices everything. It was after one of her matches, and there was only like one camera and a couple of people, and she goes, "Hey, your camera's not on. I don't see the red light." She sees everything.
Very detail oriented. Wow.
Oh yeah. And she loved coming to Chicago because she would go down to Berwyn where there was Slovak food. I'm not Slovak, so she was Czech. So it was Czech food, and she'd go down there. So she was into the communities, because one thing about tennis players, they would come here and they were here a couple of weeks and they would spend time in the community. And so she was really into it.
That's awesome. Do you have a favorite sport that you've covered, or are there any that you prefer covering?
I prefer covering when it's easy. No, I like them all. I've had some difficulties with the NFL over the concussion issues. And I've had some issues with the sports that don't take social justice seriously enough. But I enjoy it. For me, the best is to cover if they're winning or if they really, really stink. If they're 500, if they really stink, something's going to happen.
Sure.
Things are going to change. There's going to be infusion of new talent. I don't like seeing people fired. That's not me. But what I really love is when you see a team building and moving on and progressing and watching the Cubs, watching the White Sox, watching the Bulls, watching, any team and the Blackhawks, watching them when they were able to take and get the right draft picks, right talent, and watching them succeed. Think about it. We're watching Patrick Kane. He's 32 years old. He's played his 1,000th game tonight, and he's 3-time Cup champion. That's really cool. I love when their personalities grow with it, because a lot of times they're green. They don't know what they're doing. And then you see the growth in the person. You see them mature, because I can't fathom what it's like, though I'd like to, that you become a millionaire and you're 18, 19, 20 years old.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a lot to handle, and and they're on their own. I mean, that's rough. Like Derek Rose is one of my favorite people because I would tease him because he had very bad nutrition. I mean, he would eat candy all the time. I said, Derek, I said, eat a salad, eat an apple. But but when I get to meet them when they're young, and then I see them
Yeah.
develop, and I get to know them, and that to me is one of the pleasures of being able to do what I do.
Yeah, that kind of leads into my next question. What's it like having such a vast amount of experience and being able to see the ups and downs and changes in the sports themselves and then in the players themselves?
That's what the most rewarding thing. I mean, when I watched the Cubs, I felt so bad for Ricky Renteria getting fired after 2014, and after he did everything he was supposed to do, and then they hired Joe Mann. And I understood why they hired Joe Mann, but I could feel for this man. He did what he was supposed to do, and he doesn't get to enjoy the next step. But when you do see a team again, when I watched Anthony Rizzo, who was with the losing teams, and then they draft Chris Bryant, and I got to see Chris Bryant playing, and Kyle Schwarber. Kyle Schwarber was one of the neatest kids ever, and you see these pieces work, and you see Jake Arrieta become the pitcher he becomes. You see John Lester, who signs with this team after winning championships. You see that being built. Then you see them win. When I was there with them in New York when they lost in 2015, you just knew they were going to take that next leap. You just knew that was going to happen. With the White Sox, you didn't know. It was such an unusual year, but they signed a couple of free agents before the season. You see AJ Przinsky, who everyone thought was this big jerk. He's not. It's all bravado. He's actually very easy to get along with. But when you see that, or being at a World Series where I was there when they had the extra inning game, and I'm standing in. They had us far out in right field for most of the reporters, and then I went into the press box till 1 o'clock in the morning. We're standing there, watching this game. But you're watching history. And when you get to watch history, you really understand how cool it is I get to do this. And I have a very dear friend of mine who lives in Arlington Heights. His name is Judge Nicholas Primero. He used to be a judge at Rolling Meadows. And he's a big White Sox fan. He's a big sports fan, but a big White Sox fan. And he's blind. And what I like to do when I go to these occasions, when I go to a Super Bowl, or if I go to playoffs, or I like to bring back little souvenirs for people that I know.
I love that.
Maybe media guide, maybe a towel. Someday they have those towels. But with Judge being blind, I'm like, what do I do? What can I do? And I talked to him on the field right after I finished my work, and I hung up and I go, I know what to do. So I go back in the locker room and I pick something up. And then I had a red eye. Always in sports, you have red eyes all the time. The next morning, I called him up. I said, Judge, I have something for you. Put out your hand. It was the cork for one of the champagne bottles. And I put
Oh,
it in
how
his hand,
cool.
and he picked it up, and he says, is this what I think it is? I said, yeah.
Wow.
I mean, and I thought, he could feel it, he could smell it. But, and only he and I know what it was, So when I could do stuff like that, it makes my job much more wonderful.
Yeah, definitely. You can tell that you have a lot of heart and enthusiasm for all aspects of it and the human nature of it. I think that's one of the things that draws people to sports is how it brings people together.
It does. It does. I mean, when somebody asks you, well, why? For me, like for the first time I walked into Wrigley Field in doing my job, and I get to, when I get to open the gate and actually step on the field, on the grass, I look up the sky and I'm going, Gramps, I'm here. This first, the first time I got to do that, and I was fortunate that my uncle, who was also a big sports fan, I got him tickets. Actually, thankfully to the media relations department got me tickets, and they let me bring him on the field,
Oh,
and
cool.
and and he got a picture. And when you can do that type of we could do that. You feel good. It's just part
Mhm.
of, you know, I
The
don't take it.
sharing of
I
experience.
don't take it for, I'd never take anything I've done or do for granted ever.
What has been the biggest change over the course of your career? COVID being an exception, and we can touch on that a little bit next.
It's social media,
Hmm.
cell phones. Those are the two things that have changed the most. Where now players are afraid that you're recording them without
Mm.
them knowing it. You're taking pictures without them knowing it. You're going to put information on social media without them. And now they have the ability to put stuff on social media before we can ask them. So that's kind of taken away that give and take. And also, people are meaner. It's a much more vindictive reaction. Everyone's either they're jealous or they're angry or they're
Defensive.
yeah. And nobody like when I see that this player stinks or they put on social media or I'm being kind because they say a lot worse than
Sure.
that, and I'm going, do you think they want to lose? Do you think they're happy after a loss? They're never happy after a loss, and if they are, they're not going to last long. But that meanness is something that I don't feel comfortable with. I feel,
Hmm.
and that was perpetrated by, and I worked for an all sports station at one time, so I know what that's like. I know that they have to create and get things on the air, and there's some people that do it very well, but the ones that don't, and the ones that are mean spirited, or somebody who has to have a blog, just to, like, okay, let's just chastise these people left and right, and so that's built a chasm a lot between the athletes and the reporters, and that's what's changed the most. And that's what's it's the part that saddens me, and that's why I work so hard not to be in that chasm. I like to bridge that chasm as much as I can.
Do you have any advice for young women or just anyone that is interested in this field?
Well, it's not easy. Like it's gotten tougher. um I always, nobody helped me, but I help people so much. I taught at Columbia College for 20 years, and my students, I try to get them jobs, and it's not going to, you're not going to pay a lot of money, but if you really, really want to do it,
Sure.
and if you really love it, go for it. Take journalism classes, listen, read. Don't just go on social media. Actually, pick up a newspaper or subscribe to one. That's a good idea.
Hmm.
Subscribe, and also know the history. Learn the history of things. Don't find out what happened the last 5 years. One of the things I'm fortunate because, and don't go to Google for everything.
Hmm.
Pick up books, learn the history, find out, talk to people, whatever you can do. One of the things I'm lucky about is that because I had, before Google, I used to read. I used to, and I get 3 newspapers still, but I also read everything. I knew about the history of players and teams and all that information because it was natural. It was something that you picked up.
Mm.
And I know it's hard to know. And I think because we have so much information, you have to learn, okay, I have all this information. How can I narrow it down?
Funnel.
So if you can narrow it down and find out your passion. When Michael Jordan came back from playing baseball, he played first, we went to Indianapolis, and then the next game was in Boston. He was in the locker room, and he was sitting there with a laptop, and I go in there, and people, I was never afraid to talk to him. I don't know why people were. So I go up to him and chat, and he says, Cheryl, you love what you do, don't you? And I go, yes. He goes, if you ever stop loving what you do, you have to quit.
Mm.
And I go, oh, that's right. He quit for 19 months. I mean, so sometimes but you have to find that passion. And for a woman, I still think people try to challenge you more than a man, period. No doubt about it. However, women are smarter, women can multitask, and women have empathy. A lot of men don't. Some do, but I think that helps you. And if you find the path, like if you want to be a writer, write. Write every day, even if it's just a journal, write. If you want to be on the air, polish your craft. If you want to do play by play, take a recorder, sit at a game. And you can even do it with a TV. Turn the sound down and just practice, practice, practice. The more you practice, the easier it becomes. I don't take notes anymore because I know what I want to do.
Mhm.
But once when you're first starting, you take notes and talk to people. Network. That's the best way of doing it too.
Thank you for that. That's
No
really
worries.
great advice for any career, I think. Here we've got a couple more patron questions that have come in. You mentioned Carlton Fisk with the Red Sox. Do you develop relationships with any of the opposing players?
Yes, I do. I was lucky when I was doing this. I also used to do some work for Bob Costas Network and also John Madden's too. When they had radio networks, and so I used to have to go to the other dugouts or locker rooms and talk to players. And one of my favorite ones, I'm so glad I got to do this. I got asked to interview Tony Gwynn of the San Diego Padres, and I sat down with him, and I felt like I was going to school. He really taught me about video, about hitting, about the pluses, the minuses. He taught me everything that he could, and I just walked away going, I just had a collegiate class with Tony Gwynn. I've also I've gone in dugouts and I've been told to get out, skirt. That's happened to me too. But I've been able to interview, and one of my favorite ones was the Boston Celtics. When the Bulls were playing the Boston Celtics, and I went into the locker room because I was also doing work for NBC Radio, so sometimes I get assigned the other team. I went into the Boston locker room, and at the old stadium, it's like a closet. And this one particular player, I won't say who it was, he starts dancing without any clothes. And I go, okay. So I did about my business, and I walked by and I said, there really isn't much to look at. And I just walked away. So sometimes you're challenging. But the thing is, I knew about the players. I didn't go in there and I'm sometimes, like when the Charlotte Hornets when they first were a team, my job when I worked for MAQ Radio doing the Bulls broadcast, my job for the pregame, I had to go into opposing locker rooms and interview the coaches and the players. And that's where, you have to know about them. And the Charlotte Hornets had players that did not allow women in the locker room. So they kicked me out. And I sat down with their head coach, Ellen Bristow, and I go, you've got a problem. You cannot do this. I'm not going to report you to the NBA because I could, but I think you got to, take care of this. And and they did. I was refused to cover the Western Open at Butler National because I was a woman. I had a credential. I went there. They said, no, you can't cover. You're a woman. So, you get some of these little bumps in the road and you handle it. But the thing about one of my other, I love talking to other teams because you ask them about the home team here. And
Sure.
Sometimes they'll give you scouting reports. It's kind of fun.
That is fun. Let's see what else we've got. How many championships have you covered?
12.
I know you mentioned.
Let me tell you, the Bears, when they won in '85, I covered the Bulls, right?
Mm-hmm.
7. Yeah, 7. Blackhawks, White Sox, Cubs.
Wow. We've got a good sports town for stuff like that.
We've been really lucky.
Definitely.
We've been really lucky. I mean, things go into cycles where I think we're going to see one on the south side very soon of Chicago. I think the White Sox are very poised to be able to do it.
Excellent. You mentioned that your son isn't particularly into sports, but do you have any other family or family friends that you watch on a non-professional level? And what's that experience like as opposed to watching or covering?
Well, one of my nephews was actually drafted by the Royals. So,
wow.
And he's not with the Royals now, but that was a fun story because he went to Butler. His name is Eric Stout. He's a left-handed pitcher. And I was sitting in the Cubs dugout, sitting next to Ricky Renteria, and the PR director from the Cubs said, your nephew just got drafted by the Royals. That was fun. that was fun. And
That's
Ricky was,
incredible.
I mean,
Very cool.
that's kind of fun. But no, most of my husband's family, they're all sports inclined. My son played sports. He just wasn't a nut about it.
Hmm.
He just went. But what I took him to practices,
Sure.
and so he got to go to practices. In fact, when he was 9, he said, "Mom, I want to play football." Now that's a sport I'm sorry, I don't believe young kids should be playing.
Hmm.
I have an issue with that because I had a bad concussion. So I said, Jackson, I said, let me find out if Lovey Smith will let you take a practice in. So I take my son up to practice, and he's watching practice. He's off to the side, and Brian Urlacher comes walking up to him. Big Brian, and Jackson's just looking over. He's like, oh my! And we get in the car, and he's very quiet. I'm like, what's going on? He goes, Mom, I'm going to stick with soccer.
That's one way to steer the conversation and direction.
Yeah, I mean, because you got to actually see them hit, which is you can hear the tackles when you're on the same field. So I got that out of him.
Definitely. How would you say that the because you mentioned social justice and concussions earlier too, how has that evolved and changed over time and people becoming more aware and the impact that it has on sports?
I think CTE, especially what they did in Boston when they really revealed the damage of CTE. And of course, it's heartbreaking when Dave Dewerson, who I knew very well, committed suicide on my birthday, no less. And, and I knew Dave really well. And when CTE does that, that's my concern. And that's why they have to take this seriously. And they have to make sure that concussion protocol in every sport, hockey, women's soccer, this has got to be contained. They've got to find a better way of doing it. Kids should not be heading balls in soccer. They should not allow certain hits in games. I believe, the penalties should be very severe when players do hit people. I mean, I also was a friend of Daryl Stingley, who was paralyzed by a hit when he was with the New England Patriots. He's a good friend of mine, and he did not live a long life because he died young because of his situation. But that's something that has to be really looked at seriously, and they better start paying those former players the money they should be getting. As far as social justice, I am glad that players are they're not all getting it, but I think the teams have got to recognize it. I believe what the WNBA did last summer, they were the ones that were out there. They were the ones that, really, they're the ones that changed what happened in Georgia because they were powerful. They had a message and they were unified, and they had backing from most of the teams. And that's important.
We've got another baseball question. I know we're a little bit over time, but if you've got time for
No
two more.
No worries.
Our national pastime is all about making money, but not making fans. Do you think that baseball is a dying sport?
It's a sport that has to really look inward about what they're doing. I do hope that people realize there are some really young, exciting players right now. And as long as you allow them to enjoy themselves in the way Tim Anderson, Javi Baez, Luis Robert, there's a lot of great players. And it does have a problem. It does have a problem with the length of the game and the fact that kids are not going outside and playing anymore. They're playing games, video games. Something's got to change that. Maybe go into 7 innings, not having, stop having these late night games. Have the games earlier. Have them start at 5:00, 6:00. That way people could, can watch a game. The kids can go home. Right now, you don't want a kid sitting at a park at 11:00 at night, and then they have to go to school the next day if it's before summer. So they have to take care of that. They have to figure out a way to make it more agreeable for young kids to enjoy it. I live by some baseball parks, and I don't see kids playing baseball anymore. And that breaks my heart. It's really something that has to be addressed.
Definitely. I am by no means a professional interviewer, but if there is anything that we didn't discuss that you would like to bring up or talk about, now is our opportunity.
Well, I don't know. I mean, Thank you. You've done a great job.
Thank
So
you.
I've enjoyed this. I also, I try to mentor as many people as I can. And there's a lot of really good young talent that's on the horizon that I've seen, and I'm seeing them grow, and that excites me. I just hope that they get treated well, and that they get the pay and the recognition. The only thing that I would like to see is to stop being part of the story.
Hmm.
We are not the story. The games, the players, the coaches, they're the story. I just never felt comfortable that to interject myself into a story.
Well, thank you so much. Your tenacity, your drive,
My
your
craziness.
no, it's very clear why you've been successful in this field, and I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us. So
Well,
thank you
thank
so
you.
much,
Thank you for
Cheryl.
asking. Thank you.
Definitely. We did get a comment that came in that said, very interesting and enjoyable. Thank you. So passing that along.
Thank
Thank you
you.
so
Thank
much
you.
for being here, and thank you all for joining us. I hope you have a great rest of your evening. Thanks again, Cheryl.
Thank you.